Welcome to the Darkest Page podcast. Tonight's tale is Jordan's End by Ellen Glasgow. At the fork of the road, there was the dead tree where buzzards were roosting, and through its boughs I saw the last flare of the sunset. On either side the November woods were flung in broken masses against the sky. When I stopped, they appeared to move closer and surrounded me with vague, glimmering shapes. It seemed to me that I had been driving for hours, yet the ancient Negro who brought me the message had told me to follow the old stage road till I came to Buzzard's tree at the fork. "From down, it's mighty nigh to Mars Jordan's place," the old man had assured me, adding tremulously, "And young miss, she says you must come just as quick as you kin." I was young then, that was more than 30 years ago, and I was just beginning the practice of medicine in one of the more remote counties of Virginia. My mare stopped, and leaning out I gazed down each winding road, where it branched off under half-bared boughs into the autumnal haze of the distance. In a little while the red would fade from the sky, and the chill night would find me still hesitating between these dubious ways which seemed to stretch into an immense solitude. While I waited uncertainly, there was a stir in the boughs overhead, and a buzzard's feather floated down and settled slowly on the robe over my knees. In the effort to drive off depression, I laughed aloud and addressed my mare in a jocular tone. "Well, choose the most God-forsaken of the two and see where it leads us." To my surprise, the words brought an answer from the trees at my back. "If you're going to Isham's store, keep on the old stage road," piped a voice from the underbrush. Turning quickly, I saw the dwarfed figure of a very old man, with a hunched back, who was dragging a load of pine knots out of the woods. Though he was so stooped that his head reached scarcely higher than my wheel, he appeared to possess unusual vigour for one of his age and infirmities. He was dressed in a rough overcoat of some wood-brown shade, beneath which I could see his overalls of blue jeans. Under a thatch of grizzled hair, his shrewd little eyes twinkled cunningly, and his bristly chin jutted so far forward that it barely escaped the descending curve of his nose. I remember thinking that he could not be far from 100. His skin was so wrinkled and weather-beaten that, at a distance, I had mistaken him for a Negro. I bowed politely. "Thank you, but I'm going to Jordan's End," I replied. He cackled softly. "Then you take the bad road. There's Jordan's turnout." He pointed to the sunken trail deep in mud on the right. "And if you ain't objecting to a little company, I'll be obliged if you'd give me a lift. I'm bound there on my own account, and it's long ways to tote these here light wood knots." While I drew back my robe and made room for him, I watched him heave the load of resinous pine into the buggy, and then scramble with agility to his place at my side. "My name is Peterkin," he remarked by way of introduction. "They call me Father Peterkin, along with the grandchildren." He was a garrulous soul, I suspected, and would not be averse to imparting the information I wanted. "There's not much travel this way," I began as we turned out of the cleared space into the deep tunnel of the trees. Immediately the twilight enveloped us, though now and then the dusky glow in the sky was still visible. The air was sharp with the tang of autumn, with the effulvum of rotting leaves, the drift of wood smoke, the ripe flavour of crushed apples. "There's nigh a stranger, thoughtin' he was a doctor, been to Jordan's End as far back as I can recollect. Ain't you the new doctor?" "Yes, I am the doctor." I glanced down at the gnome-like shape in the wood-brown overcoat. "Is it much farther?" "Nah, sure. We're all but there just as soon as we come out of the Witten Woods." If the road is so little travelled, how do you happen to be going there? Without turning his head, the old man wagged his crescent-shaped profile. Oh, I live on the place. My son Tony works a slice of the farm of shares, and I managed to lend a hand at the harvest or corn shucking, and now and again with the cider. The old gentleman used to run the place that away afore he went deranged, and now that young un is laid up, they had nobody to look after the farm but Miss Judith. Them old ladies don't count. There's 3 of 'em, but there's all addle-brained and look as if buzzards had picked 'em. I reckon that comes from being shut up with crazy folk in that there old tumble-down house. The roof ain't been patched for so long that the shingles have most rotted away. And there's times, Tony says, when you can scarcely hear your ears for the rumpins that the wrens and rats are making overhead. What is the trouble with them? The Jordans, I mean. Just run to seed, sir, I reckon. Is there no man of the family left? For a minute Father Peterkin made no reply. Then he shifted the bundle of pine knots and responded warily. Young Alan, he's still living on the old place, but I hear he's been took now, and is going the way of all the rest of 'em. 'Tis a hard trial for Miss Judith, poor young thing, and with a boy 9-year-old that's the very spitting image of his pa. Well, well, I can recollect way back yonder when old Mr. Timothy Jordan was the proudest man anywhere around in these parts, but out of the war things sort of begun to go downhill with him, and he was obliged to draw in his horns. Is he still living? The old man shook his head. Maybe he is and maybe he ain't. Nobody knows but the Jordans, and they ain't telling for the axin'. I suppose it was this Miss Judith who sent for me. I would most likely be she, sir. She was one of the Yardleys that lived over yonder at Yardley's Field, and when young Mr. Allen began to take notice of her, 'twas the first time since way back that one of the Jordans had gone courting outside the family. That's the reason the blood went bad like it did, I reckon. There's a saying down round here that the Jordans and Jordans won't mix. The name was invariably called Jordan by all classes, but I had already discovered the names are rarely pronounced as they are spelled in Virginia. Have they been married long? 10 years or so, sir. I remember as well as if it was yesterday, the day young Alan brought her home as a bride, and there wasn't a soul besides the 3 daft old ladies to welcome her. They drove over in my son Tony's old buggy. Thought 'twas spick and span then. I was going to the house on my errand, and I was standing right down there on the ice pond when they came by. She hadn't been much in these parts, and none of us had ever seen her before. When she looked up at young Alan, her face was pink all over, and her eyes were shining bright as the moon. Then the front door opened, and them old ladies, as black as crows, flocked out over the porch. There never was anybody as pert-looking as Miss Judith was when she came here, but soon afterwards she began to peak and pine, though she never lost her spirits, and went moping round like all other women folks at Jordan's End. They married sudden, and folks do say they didn't know nothing about the family, and young Alan didn't know much more than she did. The old ladies had kept the secret away from him, sort of believing that what you don't know can't hurt you. Anyways, they never let it leak out till after his child was born. There ain't never been but that one, and old Aunt Jers declares he was born with a caul over his face, so maybe things will be all right for him in the long run. But who are the old ladies? Are their husbands living? When Father Peterkin answered the question, he had dropped his voice to a hoarse murmur. Deranged, all gone deranged, he replied. I shivered, for a chill depression seemed to emanate from the November woods. As we drove on, I remembered grim tales of enchanted forests filled with evil faces and whispering voices. The sense of wood, earth, and rotting leaves invaded my brain like a magic spell. On either side the forest was as still as death. Not a leaf quivered, not a bird moved. Not a small wild creature stirred in the underbrush. Only the glossy leaves and the scarlet berries of the holly appeared alive amid the bare, interlacing branches of the trees. I began to long for an autumn clearing and the red light of the afterglow. Are they living or dead? I asked presently. I've heard strange tattle, answered the old man nervously, but nobody can tell. Folks do say as young Alan's pa is shut up in the padded place, and his grandpa died there after 30 years. His uncles went crazy too, and the deafness is beginning to crop out in the women. Up till now it has all been mostly the men. One time, I remember old Mr. Peter Jordan trying to burn down the place in the dead of the night. There's the end of the woods, sir, If you'll just let me down here, I'll be getting along home across the old field, and thank ye too. At last the old woods ended abruptly on the edge of an abandoned field, which was thickly sown with scrub pine and broom's edge. The glow in the sky had faded now to a thin yellow-green, and a melancholy twilight pervaded the landscape. In this twilight I looked over the few sheep huddled together on the ragged lawn, and saw the old brick house crumbling beneath its rank growth of ivy. As I drew nearer, I had the feeling that the surrounding desolation brooded there like some sinister influence. Forlorn as it appeared at this first approach, I surmised that Jordan's End must have possessed once charm as well as distinction. The proportions of the Georgian front were impressive, and there was beauty of design in the quaint doorway, and in the steps of rounded stones which were brocaded now with a pattern of emerald moss. But the whole place was badly in need of repair. Looking up, as I stopped, I saw that the eaves were falling away, that crumbled shutters were sagging from loosened hinges, that old scraps of hemp sacking or oilcloth were stuffed into windows where panes were missing. When I stepped onto the floor of the porch, I felt the rotting boards give way under my feet. After thundering vainly on the door, I descended the steps, and followed the beaten path that led round the west wing of the house. When I had passed an old boxwood tree at the corner, I saw a woman and a boy of 9 years or so come out of a shed, which I took to be the smokehouse, and began to gather chips from the woodpile. The woman carried a basket made of splints on her arm, and while she stooped to fill this, she talked to the child in a soft, musical voice. Then, at a sound that I made, she put the basket aside, and rising to her feet, faced me in the pallid light from the sky. Her head was thrown back, and over her dress of some dark calico, a tattered grey shawl clung to her figure. That was 30 years ago. I am not younger any longer. I have been in many countries since then, and looked on many women, but her face, with that one light on it, is that last one I shall forget in my life. Beauty. Why, that woman will be beautiful when she is a skeleton, was the thought that flashed into my mind. She was very tall and so thin that her flesh seemed faintly luminous, as if an inward light pierced the transparent substance. It was the beauty, not of earth, but of triumphant spirit. Perfection, I suppose, is the rarest thing we achieve in this world of incessant compromise with inferior forms. Yet the woman who stood there, in that ruined place, appeared to me to have stepped straight out of legend or allegory. The contour of her face was Italian in its pure oval. Her hair swept in wings of dusk above her clear forehead, and, from the faintly shadowed hollows beneath her brows, the eyes that looked at me were purple-black, like dark pansies. "I had given you up," she began in a low voice, as if she were afraid of being overheard. "You are the doctor?" "Yes, I am the doctor. I took the wrong road and lost my way. Are you Mrs. Jordan?" She bowed her head. "Mrs. Alan Jordan. There are 3 Mrs. Jordans beside myself, my husband's grandmother and the wives of his 2 uncles." "And it is your husband who is ill?" "My husband, yes. I wrote a few days ago to Dr. Carstairs." 30 years ago, Carstairs, of Baltimore, was the leading alienist in the country. "He is coming tomorrow morning, but last night my husband was so restless that I sent for you today." Her rich voice, vibrating with suppressed feeling, made me think of stained glass windows and low organ music. "Before we go in," I asked, "will you tell me as much as you can?" Instead of replying to my request, she turned and laid her hand on the boy's shoulder. "Take the chips to Aunt Agatha, Benjamin," she said, "and tell her that the doctor has come." While the child picked up the basket and ran up the sunken steps to the door, she watched him with breathless anxiety. Not until he had disappeared into the hall did she lift her eyes to my face again. Then, without answering my question, she murmured with a sigh which was like the voice of autumn evening, "We were once happy here." She was trying, I realized, to steel her heart against the despair that threatened it. My gaze swept the obscure horizon and returned to the mouldering woodpile where we were standing. The yellow-green had faded from the sky, and the only light came from the house where a few scattered lamps were burning. Through the open door I could see the hall, as bare as if the house were empty, and the spiral staircase which crawled to the upper story. A fine old place once, but repulsive now in its abject decay, like some young blood of former days who had grown senile. "Have you managed to wring a living out of the land?" I asked, because I could think of no words that were less compassionate. "At first a poor one," she answered slowly. "We worked hard, harder than any Negro in the fields, to keep things together, but we were happy. Then 3 years ago this illness came, and after that everything went against us. In the end it was simply brooding, a kind of melancholy, and we tried to ward it off by pretending that it was not real, that we imagined it. Only of late, when it became so much worse, have we admitted the truth, have we faced the reality." The passionate murmur, which had almost the effect of a chant rising out of the loneliness, was addressed not to me, but to some abstract and implacable power. While she uttered it, her composure was like the tranquillity of the dead. She did not lift her hand to hold her shawl, which was slipping unnoticed from her shoulders, and her eyes, so like dark flowers in their softness, did not leave my face. "If you will tell me all, perhaps I may be able to help you," I said. "But you know our story," she responded. "You must have heard it." "Then it is true. Heredity, intermarriage, insanity?" She did not wince at the bluntness of my speech. "My husband's grandfather is in an asylum, still living after almost 30 years. His father, my husband's I mean, died there a few years ago. 2 of his uncles are there. When it began I don't know, or how far back it reaches. We have never talked of it. We have tried always to forget it. Even now I cannot put the thing into words. My husband's mother died of a broken heart, but the grandmother and the 2 others are still living. You will see them when we go into the house. They are old women now and they feel nothing." "And there have been other cases?" "I do not know." "Not far enough? Do you know if it has assumed always the same form?" I was trying to be as brief as I could. She flinched, and I saw that her unnatural calm was shaken at last. "The same, I believe. In the beginning there is melancholy, moping, grandmother calls it. And then—" She flung out her arms with a desperate gesture, and I was reminded again of some tragic figure of legend. I know. I was young, and in spite of my pride my voice trembled. "Has there been in any case partial recovery, recurring at intervals?" "In his grandfather's case, yes. In the others, none. With them it has been hopeless from the beginning. And Carstairs is coming. In the morning. I should have waited, but last night—" Her voice broke, and she drew the tattered shawl about her with a shiver. "Last night something happened. Something happened," she repeated, and could not go on. Then, collecting her strength with an effort which made her tremble like a blade of grass in the wind, she continued more quietly. "Today has been better. For the first time he has slept, and I have been able to leave him. 2 of the hands from the fields are in the room." Her tone changed suddenly, and a note of energy passed into it. Some obscure resolution brought a tinge of colour to her pale cheek. "I must know," she added, "if this is as hopeless as the others." I took a step towards the house. "Carstairs' opinion is worth as much as that of any man living," I answered. "But will he tell me the truth?" I shook my head. "He will tell you what he thinks. No man's judgment is infallible." Turning away from me, she moved with an energetic step to the house. As I followed her into the hall, the threshold creaked under my tread, and I was visited by an apprehension, or, if you prefer, by a superstitious dread of the floor above. Oh, I got over that kind of thing before I was many years older, though in the end I gave up medicine, you know, and turned to literature as a safer outlet for a suppressed imagination. But the dread was there at that moment, and it was not lessened by the glimpse I caught, at the foot of the spiral staircase, of a scantily furnished room, where 3 lean black-robed figures as impassive as the fates were grouped in front of a wood fire. They were doing something with their hands, knitting, crocheting, or plaiting straw. At the head of the stairs, the woman stopped and looked back at me. The light from the kerosene lamp on the wall fell over her, and I was struck afresh not only by the alien splendour of her beauty, but even more by the look of consecration, of impassioned fidelity that illuminated her face. "He is very strong," she said in a whisper. "Until this trouble came on him, he had never had a day's illness in his life. We hoped that hard work, not having time to brood, might save us, but it has only brought the thing we feared sooner." There was a question in her eyes, and I responded in the same subdued tone. "His health, you say, is good?" What else was there for me to ask when I understood everything? A shudder ran through her frame. We used to think that a blessing, but now... She broke off and then added in a lifeless voice, "We keep 2 field hands in the room day and night, lest one should forget to watch the fire or fall asleep." A sound came from the room at the end of the hall, and without finishing her sentence, she moved swiftly toward the closed door. The apprehension, the dread, or whatever you choose to call it, was so strong upon me that I was seized by an impulse to turn and retreat down the spiral staircase. Yes, I know why some men turn cowards in battle. "I have come back, Alan," she said in a voice that wrung my heartstrings. The room was dimly lighted, and for a minute after I entered I could see nothing clearly except the ruddy glow of the wood fire in front of which 2 Negroes were seated on low wooden stools. They had kindly faces, these men. There was a primitive humanity in their features, which might have been modelled out of the dark earth of the fields. Looking round the next minute, I saw that a young man was sitting away from the fire, huddled over in a cretonne-covered chair with a high back and deep wings. At our entrance, the Negroes glanced up with surprise, but the man in the wing chair neither lifted his head nor turned his eyes in our direction. He sat there, lost within the impenetrable wilderness of the insane, as remote from us and from the sound of our voices as if he were the inhabitant of an invisible world. His head was sunk forward. His eyes were staring fixedly at some image we could not see. His fingers, moving restlessly, were plaiting and unplaiting the fringe of a plaid shawl. Distraught as he was, he still possessed the dignity of mere physical perfection. At his full height he must have measured not under 6'3". His hair was the colour of ripe wheat, and his eyes, in spite of their fixed gaze, were as blue as the sky after rain, and this was only the beginning, I realised. With the constitution, that physical frame, he might live to be 90. "Alan!" breathed his wife again in her pleading murmur. If he heard her voice, he gave no sign of it. Only when she crossed the room and bent over his chair, he put out his hand with a gesture of irritation and pushed her away, as if she were a veil of smoke which came between him and the object at which he was looking. Then his hand fell back to its old place, and he resumed his mechanical plaiting of the fringe. The woman lifted her eyes to mine. "His father did that for 20 years, she said in a whisper that was scarcely more than a sigh of anguish. When I had made my brief examination, we left the room as we had come, and descended the stairs together. The 3 old women were still sitting in front of the wood fire. I do not think they had moved since we went upstairs, but as we reached the hall below, one of them, the youngest I imagine, rose from her chair and came out to join us. She was crocheting something soft and small. An infant's sack, I perceived as she approached, of pink wool. The ball had rolled from her lap as she stood up, and it trailed after her now, like a woolen rose on the bare floor. When the skein pulled at her, she turned back and stooped to pick up the ball, which was rewound with caressing fingers. Good God, an infant's sacker in that house! "Is it the same thing?" she asked. "Hush," responded the younger woman kindly. Turning to me, she added, "We cannot talk here," and opening the door, passed out on the porch. Not until we had reached the lawn and walked in silence to where my buggy stood beneath an old locust tree did she speak again. Then she said only, "You know now." "Yes, I know," I replied, averting my eyes from her face while I gave my directions as briefly as I could. "I will leave an opiate," I said. "Tomorrow, if Carstairs should not come, send for me again. If he does come," I added, "I will talk to him and see you afterward." "Thank you," she answered gently, and taking the bottle from my hand, she turned away and walked quickly back to the house. I watched her as long as I could, and then getting into my buggy, I turned my mare's head toward the woods and drove by moonlight, past Buzzard's tree and over the old stage road to my home. I will see Carstairs tomorrow, was my last thought that night before I slept. But, after all, I saw Carstairs only for a minute as he was taking the train. Life at its beginning and its end had filled my morning, and when at last I reached the little station, Carstairs had paid his visit and was waiting on the platform for the approaching express. At first he showed a disposition to question me about the shooting, but as soon as I was able to make my errand clear, his jovial face clouded. "So you've been there," he said. "They didn't tell me. An interesting case if it were not for that poor woman. Incurable, I'm afraid, when you consider the predisposing causes. The race is pretty well deteriorated, I suppose. God, what isolation." I advised her to send him away. There are 3 others, they tell me, at Staunton. The train came, he jumped on it, and was whisked away while I gazed after him. After all, I was none the wiser because of the great reputation of Carstairs. All that day I heard nothing more from Jordan's End, and then, early next morning, the same decrepit negro brought me a message. "Young miss, she told me to ask you to come along with me just as soon as you can get ready. I'll start at once, uncle, and I'll take you with me." My mare and buggy stood at the door. All I needed to do was to put on my overcoat, pick up my hat and leave word for a possible patient that I should return before noon. I knew the road now, and I told myself as I set out that I would make as quick a trip as I could. For 2 nights I had been haunted by the memory of that man in the armchair, plaiting and unplaiting the fringe of the plaid shawl, and his father had done that, the woman had told me, for 20 years. It was a brown autumn morning, raw, windless, with an overcast sky and a peculiar illusion of nearness about the distance. A high wind had blown all night, but at dawn it had dropped suddenly, and now there was not so much as a rippling in the broom sedge. Over the fields, when we came out of the woods, the thin trails of blue smoke were as motionless as cobwebs. The lawn surrounding the house looked smaller than it had appeared to me in the twilight, as if the barren fields had drawn closer since my last visit. Under the trees, where the few sheep were browsing, the piles of leaves lay in wind drifts along the sunken walk and against the wings of the house. When I knocked, the door was opened immediately by one of the old women, who held a streamer of black cloth or rusty crepe in her hands. "You may go straight upstairs," she croaked, and without waiting for an explanation I entered the hall quickly and ran up the stairs. The door of the room was closed, and I opened it noiselessly and stepped over the threshold. My first sensation as I entered was one of cold. Then I saw that the windows were wide open, and that the room seemed to be full of people. Though, as I made out presently, there was no one there except Alan Jordan's wife, her little son, the 2 aunts, and an aged crone of a negress. On the bed there was something under a yellowed sheet of fine linen, which had been handed down from some more affluent generation. When I went over after a minute and turned down one corner of the covering, I saw that my patient of the other evening was dead. Not a line of pain marred his features, not a thread of grey dimmed the wheaten gold of his hair. So he must have looked, I thought, when she first loved him. He had gone from life not old, enfeebled and repulsive, but enveloped still in a romantic illusion of their passion. As I entered, the 2 old women, who had been fussing about the bed, drew back to make way for me, but the witch of a negress did not pause in her weird chant, an incantation of some sort, which she was mumbling. From the ragged carpet in front of the empty fireplace, the boy, with his father's hair and his mother's eyes, gazed at me silently, broodingly, as if I were trespassing, and by the open window, her eyes on the ashen November day, the young wife stood as motionless as a statue. While I looked at her, a red bird flew out of the boughs of the cedar, and she followed it with her eyes. "You sent for me?" I said to her. She did not turn. She was beyond the reach of my voice, of any voice, I imagine, but one of the palsied old women answered my question. "He was like this when we found him this morning," she said. "He had a bad night, and Judith and the 2 hands were up with him until daybreak. Then he seemed to fall asleep, and Judith sent the hands, turned about to getting their breakfast." When she spoke, my eyes were on the bottle I had left there. 2 nights ago it had been full, and now it stood empty, without a cork on the mantelpiece. They had not even thrown it away. It was typical of the pervading inertia of the place that the bottle should still be standing there awaiting my visit. For an instant the shock held me speechless. When at last I found my voice, it was to ask mechanically, "When did it happen?" The old woman who had spoken took up the story. "Nobody knows. We have not touched him. No one but Judith has gone near him." Her words trailed off into unintelligible muttering. If she had ever had her wits about her, I dare say 50 years at Jordan's End had unsettled them completely. I turned to the woman at the window. Against the grey sky and the black intersecting branches of the cedar, her head, with its austere perfection, was surrounded by that visionary air of legend. So Antigone may have looked on the day of her sacrifice, I reflected. I had never seen a creature who appeared so withdrawn, so detached from all human associations. It was as if some spiritual isolation divided her from her kind. "I can do nothing," I said. For the first time she looked at me, and her eyes were unfathomable. "No, you can do nothing," she answered. "He is safely dead." The negress was still crooning on. The other old woman was fussing helplessly. It was impossible in their presence, I felt, to put in words the thing I had to say. "Will you come downstairs with me?" I asked, "outside of this house?" Turning quietly, she spoke to the boy. "Run out and play, dear. He would have wished it." Then, without a glance toward the bed or the old women gathered around it, she followed me over the threshold, down the stairs, and out on the deserted lawn. The ashen day could not touch her. I saw then she was either so remote from it, or so completely a part of it, that she was impervious to its sadness. Her white face did not become more pallid as the light struck it. Her tragic eyes did not grow deeper. Her frail figure under the thin shawl did not shiver in the raw air. She felt nothing, I realized suddenly. Wrapped in that silence as in a cloak, she walked across the wind drifts of leaves to where my mare was waiting. Her step was slow, unhurried, that I remember thinking she moved like one who had all eternity before her. Oh, one has strange impressions, you know, at such moments. In the middle of the lawn, where the trees had been stripped bare in the night, and the leaves were piled in long mounds like double graves, she stopped and looked in my face. The air was so still that the whole place might have been in a trance or sleep. Not a branch moved, not a leaf rustled on the ground, not a sparrow twittered in the ivy, and even the few sheep stood motionless as if they were under a spell. Farther away beyond the sea of Broom's Edge, where no wind stirred, I saw the flat desolation of the landscape. Nothing moved on the earth, but high above, under the leaden clouds, a buzzard was sailing. I moistened my lips before I spoke. "God knows I want to help you." At the back of my brain a hideous question was drumming. How had it happened? Could she have killed him? Had that delicate creatine nerved her will to the unspeakable act? It was incredible. It was inconceivable. And yet... "The worst is over," she answered quietly, with the tearless agony which is so much more terrible than any outburst of grief. "Whatever happens, I can never go through the worst again. Once in the beginning he wanted to die. His great fear was that he might live too long, until it was too late to save himself. I made him wait then. I held him back by a promise." So she had killed him, I thought. Then she went on steadily after a minute, and I doubted again. "Thank God it was easier for him than he had feared it would be," she murmured. "No, it was inconceivable. He must have bribed one of the Negroes. But who had stood by and watched without intercepting? Who had been in the room? Well, either way, I will do all I can to help you," I said. Her gaze did not waver. "There is so little that anyone can do now," she responded, as if she had not understood what I meant. Suddenly, without a warning of a sob, a cry of despair went out of her, as if it were torn from her breast. "He was my life," she cried, "and I must go on." She collected herself with a shudder of pain. "As long as the old people live, I am tied here. I must bear it out to the end. When they die, I shall go away and find work. I'm sending my boy to school. Dr. Carstairs will look after him, and he will help me when the time comes. While my boy needs me, there is no release. While I listened to her, I knew that the question on my lips would never be uttered. I should always remain ignorant of the truth. The thing I feared most, standing there alone with her, was that some accident might solve the mystery before I could escape. My eyes left her face and wandered over the dead leaves at our feet. No, I had nothing to ask her. Shall I come again? That was all. She shook her head. Not unless I send for you. If I need you, I will send for you, she answered, but in my heart I knew she would never send for me. I held out my hand, but she did not take it, and I felt that she meant me to understand, by her refusal, that she was beyond all consolation and all companionship. She was nearer to the bleak sky and the deserted fields than she was to her kind. As she turned away, the shawl slipped from her shoulders to the dead leaves over which she was walking, but she did not stoop to recover it, nor did I make a movement to follow her. Long after she had entered the house, I stood there, gazing down on the garment that she had dropped. Then climbing into my buggy, I drove slowly across the field and into the woods. Thank you for listening to the Darkest Page podcast. This has been Jordan's End by Ellen Glasgow. This episode has been made with the support of the Librarians of the Darkest Page podcast, Alex Smith and Tonks. I have been your host, and I wish you pleasant dreams.